So many people. So hello, everyone. My name is Adam Świtała, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Advocacy Standing Committee to today's ISME Online Cafe. As some of you know already, each meeting of the Online Cafe is hosted by a different member of one of the ISME committees and special interest groups. The main purpose of our meeting is to provide a platform for music education practitioners and students across the globe to share, discuss, and reflect on their experiences and narratives while learning from and with one another in an atmosphere of safety, trust, and mutual support. By participating in this meeting, we all agree to and take responsibility for the following. We aim at creating a welcoming and inclusive environment. We accept and honor diverse perspectives. We cultivate a sense of belonging and trust. We cultivate open and honest communication. We foster the health and well-being of all participants. We listen, respond, and disagree respectfully and avoid judgmental statements towards others. These are the rules that we read at the beginning of every session. And today's session is hosted by our colleagues from the History Standing Committee, Professor David Hebert from the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences and Professor Craig Resta from the Kent State University, USA. So that's it from my side. Let's talk and get inspired. Professor Hebert, Professor Resta, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We hope you will enjoy this session today, wherever in the world you are, whatever time zone. I know for some of us, it's quite early in the morning. We have a few of you on the west coast of the United States. For others, it's evening. Here in Europe, where I happen to be, it's mid-afternoon. We will have a session today in which there's a few brief presentations, and then we will open up to discussion of some important topics in history in these breakout rooms, and then we'll join together after that. So we'll have a tiny break for you to make a drink of whatever kind is relevant for you, whether it's coffee in the morning or something else. And then we'll come back and have that breakout room session. I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about the ISME History Standing Committee. The International Society for Music Education has a standing committee which is concerned with history, and its purpose is not only to document the history of the society itself, which is a very important task, but also to promote interest in historical issues in music education worldwide, to hopefully inspire more curiosity and interest in the next generation of music education historians, but also the field as a whole. Recognition that history is something that is relevant to any kind of a music teacher, recognizing that their field, their professional identity, has a historical basis. So that's the purpose of the History Standing Committee, and we have a website. I think I can go ahead and show that to you for just a moment here. I'll see if I can. Says screen sharing is disabled. I thought I was a co-host, but we'll get back to that later. But you can examine, if you go to the ISME website and just look for history or History Standing Committee, we can go ahead and post the link into the chat here so you can look directly at that. But we have members in the History Standing Committee from many parts of the world. Some of them are here today. We have members from Africa, from Middle East, from North America, Europe, and so on, many different areas. And I think that reflects the changes that we're seeing in interest in music education history worldwide. Mari McCarthy is here. She's been this quite central historian in the history of ISME, has produced books on the history of ISME itself and is currently at work on an additional book, very active in the 75th anniversary as well of ISME. And she has documented in her own work how the field of music education history has become increasingly international, and there's really quite important intercultural and international contributions coming from all across the world. Specifically, there's been a lot of growth recently from the Southern Hemisphere, from Africa, from Latin America, but also East Asia. So I think it's a really exciting thing to be part of this history standing committee, and I encourage you to consider participating in our sessions at ISME. At each ISME, we have one session that is devoted to mentoring the next generation of historians, where we encourage people to come with an idea and to discuss it with experienced researchers in history, where we try to provide useful advice on how to go about pursuing a study of a topic that they find very interesting. So the objectives for today, for this session, these cafes are meant to be casual. Like I said, we just have short presentations, then you make a drink, and we have discussion. But our objectives are to try to stimulate more interest in historical issues, to encourage people to reflect on how they are actually living in an interesting time where there's important changes occurring, and how aspects of what they are experiencing, whether it's something that's really inspiring and exciting or something that's problematic and concerning, that these things can be traced across historical time, and that we have a lot to learn from considering other contexts. Some of the questions that we will address today include, these are things I worked on with Craig Resta, who I'll introduce in a moment. What is it that we expect and want and need from history and music education history? How do historical ideas and research bring added value to music teaching and learning? Is there a role for studying music education history in the 21st century and compulsory school or K-12 contexts? And what are the meaningful stories from your professional and personal life in music? So we'll return to those questions. But first, Craig will give a brief presentation on his thoughts about why history matters in our field. And then I will follow that up with some discussion of methods for studying history. Then we'll take a brief session. If you have some questions or comments for us, we can address those. And then we move to our group discussion. So let me introduce Craig Resta. He's an accomplished historian of music education, a full professor at Kent State University in Ohio, which has long had one of the significant doctoral programs in music education in the United States. He's done research on many different topics in music education and has served as editor for several years, of the journal Contributions to Music Education, which is from the state of Ohio, which has long been one of the important centers for innovation in music education in the United States for more than a century. So we're very happy to have Craig here to talk with us about why history matters in music education. Welcome, Craig.
Very good. Thank you, David. I appreciate the invite, and also to ISME, History Standing Committee, to Shri and Ryan and Sandra and Andrew and so on. So thanks so much. And it's just wonderful to see so many people from around the world. It's really a thrill. I've just loved being involved with ISME, some 90 countries around the world, and just so many opportunities to explore. Before I dive in, I would like to recognize the recent loss of two giants in the international music education community, and that is Paul Lehman of the United States, who passed away a few weeks ago, about a month ago. And what a career in music education, and what he contributed, some 60 years in music teaching and learning. And then, of course, Graham Bartle, who just very recently passed, and traveled to over 100 countries. Actually, Paul traveled to over 100 countries too. They were part of what's called the Century Club. And Paul in his house, he had this big map of the world with pins with all the countries that he and Ruth traveled to. It was quite inspiring. And Graham, of course, traveling to, I think, something like 108 countries, and his International Director of Music and Music Education Institutions, providing such important information for all of us. I believe some 1,000 institutions represented. And of course, Graham always with the wry smile, a joke on the tongue, and just making everybody feel good. So we honor them. All right, now that leads me to why history matters. And the reason history matters is because of people and music and creativity. And this is what all of us engage in every day. And so what I'd like to talk to you about is how you are living history. Your personal history is part of historical understanding. And as I often say to my students, I just happen to be leading the doctoral seminar in music education history right now here at Kent State. And as I often say to them, the value of history is what will happen tomorrow, right? And looking back at historical understandings can give us a framework for what we know about ourselves and who we are. At the same time, often history is presented according to what might be called a dominant narrative. The people, the places, the events, the wars, the political entanglements, and so forth, the winners and losers, more often than not about the men instead of everybody else that's involved in history. There's a lot of other people in the world, and sometimes about a smaller group of countries in the world rather than the entire planet. And of course, as you know, there's some 195 plus countries in the world. There's a lot happening. And then also the notion of which I won't go into in too much detail, but the notion of revisionism, which is looking at history through a new lens, understanding the voices and those people that have not been heard in the past and the stories that have not been told. So when you think of personal history, you are surrounded by it, right? So every day, the people that you interact with, the school buildings or the buildings where you teach music, some scholars have discussed place-based music education, what is happening in the place and the city and the culture where you are. And you are living history. This event today, I will congratulate all of you for being part of history, because tomorrow this will be history and it will be part of the historical record. So you are participating in and as a live participant at the moment. And so thinking about the stories that you know and what is happening with your program, with your students, with the people around you. And think of all of the people in our worlds that we interact with and the stories that they carry with them. Our mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, school teachers, friends, school boards, communities, audience members, all of these people are involved in the history. And then, of course, there's the history of the music teaching and learning that you engage in, major figures that you know. For many of you who have studied music in higher education settings, often you probably find that lay people who don't understand music or who are not involved in it the same way we are will say, so what are you studying? And they assume it's about music history, that you're studying a particular composer or a piece or something like that, or what are you playing? Instead of, the kind of in-depth research and look that we give into music and how we are immersed in music education culture. And so with all of that in mind and thinking about why this is a way to understand your personal and your living history because you are in it, I'm going to tell you a few samples of my living history to perhaps spark how you are thinking about your ways of doing and the history that surrounds you. Okay. My father was in the Army Air Corps in the United States in World War II. And as an 18-year-old kid, he was sent to Europe, and his job was to help the fighter pilots after the battles figure out where they were using this early radar. And he would be in these trucks out in the field, and he would kind of rotate this disc that would try to connect. It would ping back with the planes. Well, in order for them to hear it, because the technology was so basic, all of them the radio men had to hum. So they would basically be singing so that they could hear the tone up in the air and then connect. And sometimes, they would be singing so much that they would have to stop. Like sometimes they'd pass out because they just kept pushing it, And so think about that. And then he lands at Normandy Beach 3 days after a day or two after June 6th. And you can only imagine as a 19-year-old kid what he saw on that beach. Then goes on to work for NASA and the Apollo missions and is sending men to the moon. So all of us have people in our families that are engaged in these kind of stories. One place where I taught was a building from 1939 that was part of the Works Progress Administration from Franklin Roosevelt's administration in the 1930s. And that was an important aspect of what brought us out of the Great Depression in the US and elsewhere. All of the buildings where we teach have this kind of history. The people that you know that take you to these kinds of experiences. I performed in a 13th century English cathedral, playing medieval music to be in that space. I performed in the church where George Washington and his family sat. You can see the little plaque on his booth. You know, in the house where John Marshall, who founded the Supreme Court, lived and worked. So all of us are surrounded by this. And of course, I'm talking about United States context because that's where I am, but all of you in your countries, you know, experience this. And then to think about the people in front of you that you are teaching, younger students, older students, babies, children, adults, older learners, and so forth. And each one of them comes with their own personal story. And oftentimes people think of research as this very stiff kind of white jacket. You have a white jacket in your clipboard and the mice are running around in the maze and everything is very structured and so forth. History is merely answering questions about music teaching and learning. That's it. And all of you are historians and researchers. Every day you are asking a question. Okay, I'm going to try this today to get those sixth grade clarinets to be in tune. Or I'm going to try this to get these students to participate more or to have a better understanding. And then at the end of the day, you reflect on it. And then ultimately, what you learn from that is telling a story. And research and history is merely telling the stories about the musicians and people around us and the important activities that they engage in and how we make the world a better place through music, teaching and learning, and creativity and human understanding. And that is why history matters. All right, back to the chief.
Thank you, Craig Resta, for some inspiring thoughts about history and music education. Next, a few ideas about methods for present and future research in music education history. Hopefully, some of you have been thinking about, as Craig talked, different topics that might make sense as something you might want to explore from a historical perspective. Research questions are the link between apprehending the relevance of history and designing a study to produce new knowledge. Ideally, historians aim for research questions that are unanswered and answerable. So by that, I mean they try to find specific topic that has not really been adequately addressed in previous studies or about which there's still some debate, there's still some lack of clarity, but then they design a study in such a way that it's able to produce a convincing answer to those questions. Questions that promise to develop knowledge that has some kind of significance for the field. So hopefully something that really matters to people. One of the great lessons from the global history of music education is that most of the issues, challenges, and concerns in our field are neither omnipresent nor permanent. Whatever the issues, typically one finds that there have been schools or educational systems in which particular problems have been faced and then avoided or at least minimized. So history offers some hope when dealing with difficult circumstances as a music teacher. When selecting a topic, it can be useful to be sensitive to both positive and negative emotional reactions and to cautiously use intuition. If you find you feel strongly about some issue in music teaching and learning that seems either very positive and important or deeply problematic, that may be a phenomenon that is worth examining historically to see where it came from and why it evolved in a particular way. So it's reasonable to aim for topics that connect in some way to themes that matter deeply to people today, that are part of living debates, but to explore them in a way that entails genuine wonderment and curiosity with an openness to the possibility of completely changing one's own views depending upon what the evidence uncovers. So with a critical awareness of one's motivations for the study and the biases associated with that motivation, it is also then possible to consistently challenge one's own interpretations of data, to check for any failures, to recognize cognitive dissonance. So this is worth keeping in mind because researchers tend to see what they are expecting to see, which can really be a problem that deserves more attention in research methods courses, including in this issue, historiography. As historical studies are refined, it can be useful for historians to be aware of relevant social theory from various social science fields, as these may provide valuable tools for more enlightening interpretations of the past as we seek to understand why things evolved in a particular way, what might have happened under different circumstances, what were the impacts of various individuals or different aspects of the conditions of change. Examples include anthropology, sociology, economics, political science, and so on. But caution is warranted due to the fact that theories can be fashionable and may change. And with the passage of time, many theories later come to be seen as misleading in their omissions. So how might these ideas apply to today? We think about present and future research ways of approaching music education history. Few would dispute the claim that we are now living in a digital age. Here we are, music educators from around the world meeting virtually on Zoom, which most of you access through a QR code scanned on your phones. That is taken for granted now. And the popularization of artificial intelligence tools is only a recent manifestation of much broader processes of digitization seen in daily life across recent decades. At the same time, this period is sometimes also understood as an age of post-truth, which is also deeply connected with digitization. Recognizing the present as an age of post-truth comes with the advantage that we can more clearly apprehend how propaganda ever more rapidly distorts interpretations of events in real time, especially through social media. And part of the responsibility of historians is to study critically with empathy, to understand why people both believe falsehoods or half-truths, and why they do things that are unexpected, things that may sometimes be unjust or against their own interests. And this requires awareness of the gaps between narrative accounts and actual evidence, gaps that can be highlighted in robust historical narratives. Ironically, while there is an unprecedented interest in using qualitative methods to study lived experience in music education across recent years, digital devices that automatically quantify everything are increasingly accepted into all areas of human life. More people get their news now from social media than from anywhere else, and too few demonstrate healthy forms of critical digital literacy. Spending so much time on addictive social media platforms with manipulative targeted advertising, it is unsurprising that many young students have short attention spans and struggle to discern between advertising and propaganda and other forms of authentic communication designed to educate and inform. Who needs music teachers when we can learn everything from YouTube? With that in mind, the history that appears first in a Google search will likely have far more impact than anything most of us here can write. History is important to consider as we reflect on what will be the role of human cultural heritage as AI, through social media, blurs the distinctions between self and machine, between artists and consumers, between arts and advertisements. And with unlimited access to individual behavioral data, is able to convincingly demonstrate to adolescents that it knows them better than they know themselves. It can only be assumed that AI will present a version of history that suits its own interests and that of its designers. So it seems likely that much history in the future will be competing to appear first in internet search engines and in various AI bots that are telling people about themselves, and that it will increasingly take on such forms as documentary videos and interactive VR virtual reality experiences. So about methods. There are many different ways of thinking about history and methods for uncovering and developing historical understandings. In terms of data, if we think chronologically, archaeologists are typically relied on to examine artifacts to theorize the earliest behaviors associated with both learning and music making. So that applies to all parts of the world, including the Americas, Africa, and elsewhere, certainly Asia through archaeology. Here in Europe, studies of Vikings and their musical behaviors. In terms of data, written texts of an array of kinds, as Craig mentioned, can provide insights into how people learned and taught music across centuries in many parts of the world. And with more recent topics, oral history, often requiring interviews with elderly sources, enables us to understand what can be remembered of experiences from living memory. And for the most recent decades, it becomes possible to examine how perceptions match with the trajectory of behaviors captured in the digital record. So in that sense, contemporary history transforms into a very different kind of field that is shaped by data access. So I've suggested we have both a pre-digital and a digital era we think about human history. History of all kinds entails a particular interpretation of data, which is inevitably shaped by the assumptions and concerns that are characteristic to the milieu of its author. And that is not only due to the emergence of new data, but also new theories, causing people to recognize connections that were not noticed in earlier accounts. So if we think about some of the themes that are under-discussed in music education history, most of these themes, there are some great examples of a few studies that are trying to look at aspects of them. But certainly if we consider the array of demographic factors often considered in social sciences, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, class, and so on, and how they factor into relationships between schools and changes in society, changes in both attitudes and practices, artistic changes, professional changes, and so on. Also music industry. In many countries, this is something that there's still a lot of opportunities to examine the influences that the music industry, the kind of symbiotic relationship that sometimes develops between different aspects of music industry and music education, whether it's looking at professional or educational musical instruments, sound recordings, sheet music, curriculum, and so on. Technologies is another one. There's so many different kinds of music-specific technologies, but also more general technologies impacting society that tend to be understudied in relation to changes in music education. They certainly play a major role in change within our field. There's been a few scholars looking at that. One of them is Matt Thibault in Hong Kong. He's looked at examples of the Ebersold play-along albums in jazz education, the Suzuki method for learning stringed instruments, and so on. The military is another institution. In many countries, the military has absolutely nothing to do with school music education. But in other countries, there's a very close relationship. And this is certainly worth examining. We see the same thing with particular religious institutions. Genres, if we consider specific genres, some genres tend to be featured in schools and other genres hardly appear at all. And when there's exceptions to that rule, it's very interesting to consider what are the conditions that enable certain genres to be accepted into schools? What makes that possible? Why are they prevented in other cases? What can we learn from that process of transplanting a community-based genre or professional genre into school? I see a comment from Andrew Wang that hip-hop is a good example of that. That's true. We see hip-hop used in schools in Polynesia, for instance, and it's brought in a very different way than what you see in its country of origin, the United States. Then policy studies. There's a lot of policy studies in music education history, but I think very few vividly demonstrate the particular social conditions that lead to policy changes. And that's where I think there's often a kind of a gap. There's a chronological depiction of, in a rather superficial understanding of why there is pressure on government to make, or school leaders to enact certain policy changes and what kind of impact it has. Visual history, I think there's many opportunities there. There's been some studies. I know Jer Humphreys was involved in some, but looking at the impact of visual image, we know, for instance, if you consider the entire history, human history of say, musical practices. Until, say, the advent of sound recordings. Technically, they began in 1860s, but it wasn't until 1880s and later that sound recordings started to be popularized. Music up to that point was very much connected with image. You were there with the musicians. There was dance, there was ritual, there were all kinds of things to actually see and experience with the sound. For this brief period of around 150 years, music became more divorced from image, and people started really listening specifically just to the sound. But once again, with video, with changes in technologies, we're seeing much more of a connection between image and sound, and that's applying across all genres, whether it's popular music like Taylor Swift or classical music like Yu Wang, for instance. Also, large concepts. It's possible to take a huge concept in a field, like it could be improvisation, it could be something like inclusion, competition. This is something that Sean Powell has looked at, for instance. But you can take a particular practice that is concerning or problematic or hopeful, whatever the emotional kind of reaction to it is that makes it important. But this particular concern or this practice, and trace it across time and see what are the changing conditions that have led to different ways of addressing that particular practice or concern in music education contexts. Other interesting developments, post-colonialism and decolonization. We see some really interesting examples of that from China in the work of Wai Cheng-ho, who's written many very interesting books examining Hong Kong, for instance, or Taiwan. And also with Uganda, I think there's some great examples from Branko Sekalaga and Milton Wabiona and others. And another area where I think there's a lot of potential for more kind of method development is on the side of communication of music education history. If we consider the potential of documentary films and also of interactive VR experiences. I briefly mentioned those earlier, but I think those are worth reflecting on as we consider different topics that you may have a personal interest in. So those are some of my thoughts about methods in music education history, but I'd like to take just maybe one more minute and read a short passage from one of my books. This is called Theory and Method in Historical Ethnomusicology. That may sound like it has nothing to do with music education, but actually there's a significant part of our conclusion chapter that's specifically looking at music education history, and we're trying to show how these kinds of methods can be useful for those wanting to examine music education history. Andrew Wang is asking for the name again. It's called Theory and Method in Historical Ethnomusicology. I just wanted to read a very brief passage from here. What are the prospective sources for historical data of relevance to music? So these are places you can look to find data that could inform a historical study in music education. In addition to sound and video files of music performances, studio recordings, and interviews with musicians and elders, we must also consider the potential usefulness of examining music-related contents of personal letters, journals, newspaper articles, concert programs, concert posters, album covers, musical scores, which includes the musician's personal markings even. That can be fascinating. Musical instruments, music-related items like plectrums, music stands, metronomes, photographs, government records, such as policy documents, reports, demographic statistics, tax figures, and so on. General archaeological artifacts, which indicate something about the lifestyle of people. Music periodicals, music curricula, including textbooks and tune books. And in the case of very recent history, online wikis and discussion boards. But I think nowadays that would also include the vast array of social media. So there's so many different possibilities out there of really interesting topics to consider. If you think about what matters to you emotionally in music education, things that you think are really exciting and interesting and have this great potential, or things that you're really concerned about. What's going to happen to music teaching now? How are we going to survive this? those kinds of things are worth examining from a historical perspective, because if we have more deep, rich, robust accounts of what has happened across time, what is likely to have been the reasons that it occurred in this particular way, the context, the antecedents, and so on, I think we're much more likely to be able to develop a deeper understanding of how to solve problems in our field, but also a stronger sense of professional identity, a sense of where we came from as music teachers, what we are all about, what are our objectives as a field, how are things changing across time, and so on. So I think there's so many really very interesting possibilities here, and I think Craig pointed out some important ideas here. If you think about your own life, your own experience, your family, the stories that people have, and imagine yourself when you are near the end of your life, reflecting back on what has happened to you as a music teacher. Thinking in different ways about the possibilities here, I think we have a chance here in our discussion to reflect on these kinds of questions, to share ideas and learn from each other. So we can take about 10 minutes now to see if you have some immediate reactions, questions, comments to things that Craig and I shared here. And then after that, we'll share the discussion questions that we're hoping you can be inspired to discuss with each other. We'll take a little break and then we'll come back and see what you come up with through your breakout group discussions.
David, may I throw in a few additional thoughts
ahead,
before we
please.
dive into those? Thank you. Fabulous ideas there, and so much to think about. David's always on the cutting edge with what's happening. And it inspired me to think of a few other thoughts related to historical method, as it were. And for those of you who may not have written history or are considering it, or maybe find it a bit intimidating or whatnot, I would first say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So if you have an idea that you're interested in, just write it down, right? You can even use a pencil and a paper, write it in a word processing program or whatnot. Just write it down, even if it's just a paragraph. And then as you learn more about it, as you think about it, just put it down. Don't worry that it has to be in a formal, comprehensive way. Just get it on the page. And then in terms of understanding how you do it, you're making decisions about, do you want to write about the chronology or the themes or whatnot? And for those of you who are looking at ways of how to do it, I'd point you to Mari McCarthy has a very fine chapter in one of our music education research texts on historical method, as well as Philip Hash. And they can give you a very good perspective on how you look at history. And so think of it as collecting stories, as collecting artifacts. If you find information that's useful, put it down. And then in terms of thinking about how you analyze it, what do you want to find from it? And the other thing is, for historical research, oftentimes when you look at historical studies, you will see something about the method used for this research was historical method, period. And then they go on. Well, it's a lot more than that. Describe what you did. How did you find the sources? How did you analyze them? What is there? What are the meanings? And then how did you structure them according to themes? And it's perhaps good to have a central research question or guiding idea or idea of inquiry, and that helps you then put it down and then organize it, and then finally kind of organize it in a way like a lesson plan. You have your objectives, you've got your main concepts presenting the data, and then you're bringing back, and by answering the questions, have you met the objectives of the study?
We have a question in the chat here from, and I'm afraid I will have trouble pronouncing this, but I believe it's Chuchana Polyak. She says, how can one advocate for the place of historical research among research approaches in music education? Most prominent journals don't even consider historical papers. That's part of what we're doing today, is to generate, hopefully, more interest in historical research in the field. And it's part of the whole purpose of this History Standing Committee that I mentioned earlier. So please, you are welcome to come visit us at ISME and to join the committee if you're interested in that, join the committee's activities. But what you've said about most music education journals, I think that may depend on which journals you're aware of or which location you happen to be in. Mari McCarthy is here. She's served recently for years as editor of the Journal of Historical Research in Music Education, which is on Sage, a major publisher. And that journal exclusively publishes historical research. And there are several journals in the field. For instance, Journal of Research in Music Education. It was founded by a historian and began with some really interesting historical articles, including one that traces the history of the very first music programs at universities in Europe. I quote the very first issue of the Journal of Research in Music Education sometimes because I think it's important for students to know, especially students who have very little familiarity with the Middle East and Middle Eastern traditions, to be aware that when music was first established at universities in Oxford and University of Paris and so on, one of the books on the curriculum was the Great Book of Music by Al-Farabi, who was an amazing scholar. And it's interesting for them to know something about Al-Farabi and how his work was translated into Latin and then was part of the curriculum at that time. But I think you can find historical articles if you look for them in some of the major journals, but it's true that there are certain ones, for instance, Psychology of Music is very unlikely to publish a historical article. Certain journals tend to emphasize contemporary qualitative methods. Others emphasize, there's a journal of empirical music research and so on, which is really a lot of experiments. But I think it's fair to say that most music education research journals, from my experience, are open to the possibility of sometimes publishing a history study. And then there are others who really emphasize that. So perhaps it depends on your location. It may be that in some countries there's much less openness to historical research. Craig, do you want to add something to that, or is there another question?
Well, no, that all of those are good points, and that is an excellent question. And yes, sometimes people ask, why is history valuable? Because it happened in the past, it's gone, and so on and so forth. But as we've given you some ideas how to dispel that notion. But yes, in other countries, it may be less of the case. There may be an emphasis on more scientific research and so forth. And so at the same time, many of the journals that we mentioned are international publications, even though they may be based in the US or England or other English-speaking countries. And if you've got an idea and you want to put it together, just send it in.
Yes. International Journal of Music Education is also open to historical studies. Journal of Historical Research in Music Education is open to international studies. So if you're to do a study on history of music education in Hungary, either of those journals is worth exploring. Yes, but as Craig was alluding to, I think part of what's happened is in many cases, music education is sometimes housed in a faculty of education where there's a focus more on education that's directly concerned with using empirical methods to test or propose solutions to particular ongoing problems or something like that. And sometimes the methods courses emphasize psychological research or social science approaches. But history has been an important part of the toolkit of researchers in our field for generations. The other factor is that the field of musicology, there are people who work in historical musicology who sometimes do research on music education history. There's been some really interesting work on, for instance, Renaissance and Middle Ages music education in monasteries and so on, and work on Spanish missions or topics like this, which is by people who are not really in music education programs, but are interested in contributing to what's relevant to us. I mean, we should be aware, I think, of music education all across historical time. Occasionally there's a study even from, sociology or anthropology or other fields on music education. Are there other questions here, or should we just go ahead and prepare for the group discussion? Questions or comments about the topics that Craig and I brought up. Craig was talking about why history matters for music education and encouraging us to reflect on personal situations, including family experiences and so on. And then I talked about historical methods, how history is not simply about describing facts in a sequential order, a chronological, objective way, but that there's actually the matter of interpretation, and that, of course, we should aim to be as accurate and robust and complete as possible. But at the same time, to be aware that at different points in time, people are concerned about different things. In the 1950s, there wasn't a lot of discussion of gender equity, for instance, in history. And later, that became a major concern, and it's been something that there's been much more research in music education looking at gender imbalances and the problem of there being enormous gaps in the field from there being so much of a focus on men historically. But that's just one example. The same with different classes, different ethnic groups, and so on. There's all kinds of different demographics that have, until recently, not been as well represented in music education history. But I think a lot of these problems are being much improved, partly through the Journal of Historical Research in Music Education and Mari's leadership of that journal. I see something here. I did my PhD in music education, partly dealing with ISME. Okay, that's great. I don't see specific questions here. So our plan for today then, it's 10 minutes until some hour, depending on where you are in the world. But what we'll do now is take a 5-minute break, and we can come back, and then you will have a breakout group that you're assigned to. You'll be in a group of maybe 6, 7, 8 people, who then we will post in each breakout group the particular set of questions, or maybe Craig, you could go ahead and post them here as well. And these are the questions we're hoping you can discuss for about 20, 25 minutes. We'll set a timer, and the breakout room will automatically dissolve, and we'll all be together here again. So but you have at least 20 minutes to discuss these questions that I think you'll find are really interesting. There's a chance to really share and learn from each other. So we'll have the breakout rooms set up for you within about 5 minutes. So you can go ahead and make a drink for yourself. I understand some people may have other things they need to do, but please, everyone who can, these questions, I think, I sense that by reflecting on these questions, we will all come up with some really interesting, useful ideas together. So the questions are, yeah.
Just quickly, someone, Andrew asked if he has to, if they have to leave, should they join the breakout room? And I would say, everybody just dive into a room, and if you have to slip out, just go when you need to. Yes. Lots of engaging conversations.
Good to hear.
We need to, next ISME Cafe, we have to make it 6 hours, 2 hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, these conversations could go on for hours, I'm sure. Yes, so hopefully you've had a chance to get to know a few more people at least. And yes, I'm seeing many people are having to leave. That's all right. I think in a few seconds, everyone will be back who's going to come. That is it. I think that's all that we have. Okay. Yeah. Because of the time change, which was unexpected, some of us are, we have a smaller number now, 17. That's fine. All right. So we were just hoping that from It doesn't even need to be all of the groups, but from at least a few of them, we could have someone highlight a few of the interesting ideas that were shared, some points that you think would be worth sharing with the larger group. Group 1 happened to be the one that had Anna and Mari in it and a few others. Were there some interesting points that you'd like to share with all of us?
Go ahead, Anna.
Free to share with you whatever we have been talking about. Please, Marie.
Well, I think there was a dominant theme, and please add to it, Anna and Shri, the lack of linguistic diversity in the publication of history. But what can we do about it? What's possible? And looking to future possibilities through AI maybe and some small group comparative work. So that definitely was one theme. And knowing that ISME started out with 4 official languages in 1953, and that kind of wasn't able to be maintained. And we couldn't say that there are 4 official languages of ISME today, because there are many, many more to be inclusive. So that was one theme. And then how the values that historians and music educators bring to historical documentation changes from one era to another. And I think Susanna was bringing up the point of Kodai and that era and what was valued then versus what is valued today. So I think there were 2 of the main points. Maybe I missed some others, but there were 2.
Yes, linguistic diversity and changing views, changing values in the profession, I suppose.
In the presentation of the past, the representation of the past.
If I might throw out a question for Mari, you've looked at obviously the history of ISME back to the very beginning. Do you see today certain traditions and practices and so forth that have remained, that have never really changed within ISME as a positive, meaning it's something that has worked and so on, versus maybe a couple of traditions that have fallen away?
Well, I'll do one of each, maybe, and that's a big question, Craig. But the one that may have fallen away is the one I have already spoken of, the linguistic diversity. But it's just difficult. It's a real challenge, and one that was a conclusion of my 50th anniversary book, History of ISME. The one that I see, and again, there has been COVID, and I wasn't the only one I missed since 1992, I think was in 2018 in Baku. But I think performing groups, the efforts that have been made over the years, I've watched each decade to bring groups from Hong Kong, from Moscow, from Lyon, to the ISME, no matter where it is. I think that is one. And having been at all of those conferences, that's one thing that sticks in my mind. The beautiful performances, ones that I would never have seen had I not been in the space of the ISME Biennial Conference. So I'd say the power of performance is and comparatively, and music to bring people together is one major achievement of ISME over the decades.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Looks like Anna's.
Yeah, thank you. May I dare to say that this is wonderful, and you are asking for something important. I think that what is important is that ISME is still alive. And that may look like a funny word, but it is so difficult. Having been the president of ISME myself, it's so difficult to pull people together from a diversity of cultures and to get an institution going on that I insist in making that a relevant point. There are many things which are very difficult, and probably technique will overcome some of the difficulties. We have been talking about the possibility of having a chip of each language included. I don't know. But the matter is that to have a society keeping the path and meeting every second year and pushing and promoting. And it's, as Paul Lehmann used to say, is every single person mission. And then to be strong-headed enough, I don't know whether you have that expression in English, but in Spanish it's very clear, to keep going in your part of the world. Mine is the southern part of South America. South America is enormous, it's 2 languages, but I think this is very important. And I think that the standing committee as a conception was a very good idea. Thank you, Marie, for whatever you have been doing.
Excellent.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Related to that, other quite important developments in ISME have been the regional meetings. So we have a regional meeting for most every part of the world. We have one in South Asia, we have one in Africa, Latin America, as Anna mentioned, and these are especially important for trying to diversify ISME to try to reach everyone and have it. Because historically, there was more of an emphasis on Europe and North America, and now it's becoming much more of a global organization, which is really exciting.
David, allow me to say that that was under my presidency that we created the Latin American regional for the sake of having people talking and presenting papers for the first time in their life in their own language. Because I remember when I presented my first research paper in Graz in 76, having to present the paper in English. No, I remember the nerve, I remember whatever, and I stopped talking. I'm a too much talker person. Sorry about that.
Thank you. It's wonderful points. We do need to be a bit mindful of the time. You're right. So there were at least 2 other groups. I think probably Chuchana or Ashok. We have some others who, Wendy, I forget which group you were in.
Yes, yeah, David.
Whoever, yes.
Yeah, Wendy and Ashok and Suchin were in our group, and perhaps Wendy, you could tell that story about how the Maori influence has impacted your thinking of music teaching.
Yes, very much so. I was just saying in our group that when we grew up as children in New Zealand, that we were taught poi dances and the Maori songs and things like that, and they were wonderful. But at no time did I really have a full understanding of the Maori influence on our culture and on music until later on. I did research myself and had a Maori family as part of the people who I was interviewing, and they introduced me to kapa haka and their music traditions. And it just widened my eyes in ways that were just extraordinary. I had a strong Western European background in music performance, and felt that I was I understood a fair bit, but not until I saw the Maori influence did I understand just how far-reaching music was, and being able to understand identity and what constituted an entire. It wasn't just the Maori thing; it was about humanity. It was about being who you are, and music was so much underpinning that. So I found it I didn't know much about Maori music, and I still don't, even though we're surrounded with it, but seeing it from the Maori people was just tremendous. I'm still affected by it now.
That is really fabulous. Thank you for sharing that. And of course makes us think in all of our countries about the influence of native peoples and the indigenous and how
Absolutely.
that impacted us.
Yes. I mean, music's very, very different, isn't it? It's a very unique expression for each of us, but I think it's a common thing. But when it brings out the humanity, the real person, I think that's something which is worth taking notice of. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. And perhaps, Ashok, you'd like to tell us, similar to what you did in the group about India, because as we discussed, of course, India is 1.4 billion people. It's a very big place, the north and the south, the coast, etc. And that you actually started as a as a rock musician, and then now have transitioned into higher ed?
Thank you. Well, it has been very interesting indeed, quite a journey. And India has, as I was sharing with the group, India is such an amalgamation of different genres of music and cultures. It's so diverse that you can just go deeper and deeper and still not find the deep ends, because there's the north and the south. Although it seems like a divide, there are unifying factors between the Hindustani classical music and the Carnatic classical music. Well, these are classical genres, but we also do have a lot of folk music where there are, Adivasis and so on, who have their own tribal music as well. And of course, the movies have been have had such a profound impact in the musical landscape, where every industry has shaped music to a large extent. Of course, drawing from various classical genres, because movies started off that way. They introduced classical genres, and also from the West. And we also are, we have this landscape of contemporary music where no genre of music is left behind, be it hip hop or pop or country, jazz, blues. And we also do have Oriental music. K-pop is also making a big wave here in India. So we've left no stone unturned. It's just, I guess India has just been that embracing of all cultures, embracing of all people. And that's really helpful while we interact with students, because we are able to draw from each one's culture and also bring them to a central point of unifying within the music. So that's really been the story here in India. Of course, there's a lot to say, but we definitely have to be mindful of the time.
Super, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have just one last group. If Mimi is still here, perhaps she can share a few highlights from this group.
Hello, everyone. Here is Mimi from Group 3. And we have Andrew Wong from New York and myself from Taipei, Taiwan. So luckily we have David to join us. So we are in total three people in our group. So Andrew have shared his opinion about hip hop and have some discussion with David. But I'm not really familiar with this area, but I provide my perspective and the information about the music education history in Taiwan. So the modern school education system in Taiwan has been established by a Japanese government during the Japanese colonial period. But after that, Taiwanese had a Chinese dominance. And then we also have the migration from Southeast country and the migration from the mainland China. And also we have 16 tribes of indigenous people. So it's quite multicultural background. So this kind of music education history also impact our philosophy and belief for our education. We also mentioned the policy about in the textbook, we should have at least 50% of the domestic culture and music element inside. It's a aim for the cultural equity and to respect every tribe or different group of community. So that is what we have discussed in our group, mainly to provide the background and the philosophy for the diverse and multicultural music education background in Taiwan. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Was there one other group, or is that all of the groups? Sorry, I'm not completely sure, because we had, I think we ended up with only 3 in the end. Is that correct? All right. So, Craig, do you have any thoughts about unifying themes across these group discussions, or any final words to share with people about this theme of how history matters in music education?
Sure, absolutely. And then certainly, if others would like to pipe in, just raise the hand. So one of the compelling aspects to me of being involved in ISME is the sheer amount of diversity, multicultural views, and different perspectives. Some 90 plus member countries in ISME, perhaps that's even growing more. 195 countries in the world, and that every country has this history, this background, this way of thinking, this way of doing. And even just listening to the conversations here with a small group of countries, how many different ways we think about it. And we understand our own musical cultures, but in the world today, with technology and how we interact, the thought of what is native or indigenous music to a particular country has many different meanings. And what are we teaching our kids, and what are they understanding? And what is our role in teaching them the technical aspects of performance versus understanding the meaning of music, and the role of creativity, and also the role of the music teacher, right? Are we the sage on the stage, or are we the guide on the side? And how do we help people understand their own meaning and their own identities? And as to the, kind of the impact of history, I mentioned earlier discussing kind of the personal aspect of it. And I neglected to mention a point that I wanted to make, that I looked back at my own music teachers, going back their teacher to their teacher to their teacher. And in my case, my violin professor goes all the way back to Arcangelo Corelli in the 17th century, right? In the 18th. Well, all of our teachers probably have these connections, and where do we go? And the other is just the meaningfulness of history. And, many of you may know the American composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein. And recently there was a movie released about his life. And there's been some positive and negative reaction, but someone asked me what I thought about the movie, and I said, well, regardless of what happened in the content, he was such an important person to music in the world, and what he did to influence people, and that for that short period of time, he was alive again, and we were all together on the same planet experiencing that and thinking about his ideas, and how it inspires us to think about the people that are in front of us and why that's important. And that history plays this role of constantly talking to us and influencing how we're thinking, and making us understand what we do better, so that we can make the musical experiences of young people better. Because that's really what it's about. As I said in the small group, music teachers have difficult jobs. We don't get paid enough. We don't get enough respect. But then we have a child in front of us who figures out a concept, who shows a sense of joy, their eyes light up, and then we all melt, and we're good for another 6 weeks, and that's part of what we do as music teachers. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Craig. So music teaching is a profession, and if we want to be training music teachers to be able to endure the challenges of their field, to have the understandings of where their field came from, its foundations, then history needs to be part of that. And that's one of the main points, I think, of the History Standing Committee, is trying to encourage music teacher education programs also to recognize the value of historical understanding as one of the essential elements in the training of music teachers, to encourage resilience and reflection on where the field came from, where it's going, what are the history of ideas and practices in the field. And that's really quite important, as Craig mentioned. So I think that's about it for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope it's been stimulating for you. And please keep the History Standing Committee in mind if you're wanting to participate in some of our activities. You are welcome. We will have this kind of mentoring session at ISME. Anyone is welcome to join that if you have some idea for a historical study that you'd like some guidance on. We'd really be happy to meet you there and to hear from you, and to give a chance, have a chance to make some hopefully helpful suggestions. And thank you everybody for joining. It was really nice to see Anna again, a former ISME president. It's wonderful to see Mari here as well, who's been important for documenting the history of ISME. And to see people here from so many countries, from Hungary and Taiwan and China and New Zealand and Poland and Iceland and everywhere.
Canada, yes.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you. Thank you
Take
so
care,
much.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.